At the height of his power, Adriano had everything. He was young, physically imposing, and standing at the centre of the footballing world. In the mid-2000s, there was no more frightening sight for a defender than Adriano charging towards goal. They called him the Emperor, a man built like a heavyweight boxer, with the touch of a poet and a left foot that could break nets and spirits in equal measure. He was touted as the heir to Ronaldo, the next king of Brazil and the future of the game. From the narrow streets of the Via Cruzeiro to the floodlit grandeur of the San Siro, his rise was meteoric. And yet, within just a few years, it was all gone. Not through scandal or betrayal, but through something far more difficult to watch. Because this is not simply a story about a career that ended too early. It's a story about grief and what happens when success can't insulate a young man from loss. To understand the man that Adriano would become, you first have to understand the soil from which he grew. He was born in 1982 in Via Cruzeiro, one of Rio de Janeiro's most notorious favelas. This wasn't the Brazil of postcards and tourist brochures. It was a world shaped by poverty, by the constant background hum of violence. In the favela, you learn to see the world differently. You learn early that survival itself is an achievement. But for a young Adriano, it wasn't a prison, it was his sanctuary. He remembers those years not with bitterness, but with nostalgia. A genuine childhood, he would later say. Barefoot afternoons on dirt pitches, playing against boys older, stronger, and far less forgiving than he was. He practiced relentlessly, not because he was dreaming of contracts or fame, but because the ball had become part of him, an extension of instinct, a language he understood before he understood words. In later years, he would criticise the modern generation of children, tapping on screens, and he would always return to those early days, to the reality of football in the favela, where every touch of the ball felt physical, immediate, almost sacred. His family recognised his gift early. They pulled what they had, simply to send him to the Flamengo Academy. At just 7 years old, his family's collective hope was already resting on his shoulders. For 8 years he laboured, often doubted by coaches who believed his growing frame would make him too heavy, too slow, too clumsy for the professional game. They couldn't have been more wrong. By 16 he'd reached the senior squad, and by his second appearance he was scoring against Sao Paulo. At 18 he was wearing the shirt of the Brazilian national team, one of the youngest players ever to do so. The emperor had not yet been crowned, but the throne was already being prepared, and the favela had never left him. When Adriano was still a boy, his father, Almir, was caught in a shootout. A stray bullet struck him in the head. He survived, but he would carry that bullet in his skull for the rest of his life. This was the world that Adriano was growing up in, and it forged a bond between father and son that was built not only on love, but on survival. Almir was the one who kept him away from the gangs, the one who pushed him to train and told him again and again that his left foot was his escape. Every time Adriano stepped onto the pitch, he was never playing only for himself. He was playing for the man who had survived a bullet so that his son may survive the streets. In 2001, the scouts at Inter Milan decided they'd seen enough and that they had to bring in this force of nature to Italy. His arrival at the San Siro is the stuff of legend. It began on the grandest stage imaginable. His first match came in a friendly against Real Madrid at the Santiago Bernabeu, against a team that contained Figo, Zidane and Hierro, in a stadium where young players usually learn very quickly how small they are. Adriano entered as a second-half substitute, showing no trace of nerves. When Inter won a free kick on the edge of the penalty area, the senior players stepped aside and allowed the teenager to take responsibility. He took a long run-up and struck the ball with extraordinary force. It was later measured at 105 miles per hour, and it flew into the top corner of the net. It didn't merely win a friendly, it announced a player. Javier Zanetti would later say that in that moment, Inter believed they had found the new Ronaldo. It was a comparison that followed Adriano for the rest of his career, both a compliment and a burden, and one that quietly shaped many of the expectations placed upon him. Inter, already crowded with attacking talent, decided that he still needed time, and he was sent first to Fiorentina and then to Parma, and it was in Parma that his reputation truly began to harden into something more permanent. Playing alongside Adrian Mutu, Adriano began to score with a regularity that defied logic. He struck goals from distance, overpowered defenders in the air, and ran through challenges with a balance that seemed impossible for a man of his size. In 2 seasons, he scored 23 goals in 37 matches, and every one of them added to the sense that Inter had allowed something extraordinary to develop away from them. In January 2004, they paid €23 million to bring him back. He returned not as a prospect, but a solution. He told the press that he was home and that he promised to become a great player, but the truth was that he'd already crossed that line. What he was becoming now was something rarer. The second half of the 2003-04 season confirmed it. 9 goals in 16 games carried Inter back into the Champions League places. And with each performance, the nickname, the Emperor, felt less like a piece of theatre and more like an accurate description. On the final day of the season against Empoli, he produced a performance that has never really left the memory of those who saw it live. He scored once with a header that seemed to defy gravity, and then again with a solo run in which he brushed past 3 defenders, deceived the goalkeeper and rolled the ball calmly into the net. When he tore off his shirt, it felt less like a celebration and more like a declaration. Zlatan Ibrahimovic would later say that 50% of football is mental, and that Adriano, in that moment, appeared mentally unbreakable. What made him so compelling was not only his strength, but his technique. He had the Brazilian magic, a first touch that softened even the hardest pass, and a capacity to manipulate the ball in spaces where there should have been no space at all. He became a cult figure not only for Inter supporters, but for a generation of football fans who felt they were watching a player unlike any they'd seen before. In the age of Pro Evolution Soccer 6, he became almost mythical, the striker who could score from anywhere on the pitch. But in the real world, he was something more complex and more fragile. A man who seemed to combine 2 different eras of football, the old-fashioned powerhouse and the modern technician. And for a brief moment, it seemed that nothing in the game could stop him. Then came the summer of 2004. Brazil travelled to the Copa América in Peru without their greatest stars. Ronaldo was absent, Ronaldinho didn't travel, Roberto Carlos stayed at home. In their absence, the weight of a nation settled quietly on the shoulders of a 22-year-old striker from Rio de Janeiro. Adriano responded by becoming the tournament's top scorer, and its outstanding player. He scored a hat-trick against Costa Rica, twice against Mexico, and in the final against Argentina with Brazil trailing in the dying seconds, he produced a moment that defined his career. He controlled a high ball with his back to goal, lifted it into the air and struck a volley into the corner of the net. It was a goal of instinct and audacity, the kind of moment that silences a stadium. Brazil won the trophy on penalties, and after the final, Adriano dedicated the victory to his father, Almir. He said that the title belonged to him, that he was his great friend and partner, and that without him he wouldn't have been where he was now. He was 22, he had the Copa América, he had the love of his country, and he was, in that moment, the most valuable player in world football. But 9 days later, the phone rang. Zanetti has often spoken about this day. He remembers being in the room when Adriano answered a call from Brazil. It was the news that his father had died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 44. The scream that came from Adriano's throat was something Zanetti has never forgotten. And in that single moment, his world did not simply tilt, it collapsed. He'd been more than a father to Adriano, he was his anchor. The man who kept him away from the gangs and believed in him when there was nothing else to believe in. The man for whom every goal had been scored. Without him, the football, the fame, and the millions of euros felt empty. Adriano returned to Italy, but the man who stepped off the plane was not the man who'd left. The impact of the loss can't be overstated. In professional sport, we expect athletes to be stoic, to return quickly, to play through pain, but grief isn't an injury that heals with time on the pitch. Adriano was expected to return to the San Siro and continue being a god. In reality, he was a grieving son, far from home, trying to survive in a country whose language and culture still felt so different. He tried to hide it and bury himself in the game. The 2004-05 season was, on paper, remarkable. He scored 28 goals in all competitions. He won the Coppa Italia. To the supporters in the stands, he was still the emperor. After every goal, he pointed to the sky. It became his ritual, his private conversation with the man who was no longer there. But inside, something had begun to fracture. He was alone through the long Italian winter, separated from his family, carrying success on his back and grief in his chest. Sleep became difficult, training became an obligation rather than a refuge, and he began to look for silence. At first, the drinking was an escape, about numbing the nights when the phone call replayed in his head, about dulling the ache that no goal could touch. He since admitted that he did not really want to train anymore, he only wanted to go home. The depression became a silent opponent, and one that no amount of physical strength could defeat. His weight began to fluctuate, his discipline softened, and to those who watched closely, the first cracks were beginning to show. By the time the 2006 World Cup arrived, Adriano's decline was no longer a private matter. It had become a public story discussed openly in Brazil and watched closely across Europe. He travelled to Germany as part of Brazil's Magic Quartet alongside Ronaldo, Ronaldinho and Kaká. On paper it was one of the most gifted attacking units in international football. In reality it was a team out of balance, burdened by its own celebrity and unable to find cohesion that had once defined Brazilian sides. Adriano scored during the tournament, but the explosive force that had once terrified defenders was no longer there. He looked heavier, slower and more distant from the game. And when Brazil were eliminated by France in the quarter-finals, the reaction at home was brutal. The criticism was relentless, and for Adriano it was simply more noise added to a mind already crowded with grief. He returned to Inter and found himself trapped in a pattern that was becoming difficult to escape. The 2006-07 season marked the beginning of the end of his time at the highest level of European football. His relationship with Roberto Mancini deteriorated. He began missing training sessions. Inter attempted to shield him from public scrutiny. Clubs spoke of muscle injuries and sudden illness, but within the dressing room the truth was already understood. Adriano was struggling. In later years he would speak openly about that period, about arriving drunk because he could not stop drinking, about being taken to the medical room so that photographers would not see him. The club tried to help him, but Adriano was struggling under the weight of the load. In 2007, Inter decided to send Adriano back to Brazil, in the hope of saving the man, even if the player could no longer be saved. He joined Sao Paulo on loan, and for a brief period, the return home appeared to calm him. He scored 11 goals in 19 matches, and supporters embraced him. For a moment it seemed possible that proximity to family and familiar streets might restore something that had been lost. But he continued to be seen in nightclubs and missed training sessions, and the discipline that had once defined him continued to erode. In 2008 he was sent back to Milan, where he came under the authority of Jose Mourinho. Mourinho made it clear that the team would come before any individual, and Adriano briefly showed a resurgence. He showed flashes of the old power and played a part in Inter's march towards another Scudetto. Yet something fundamental had changed. He was no longer playing with the joy that he once showed, but out of obligation. And the distance between the player he'd been and the man he'd become was growing wider. After returning from the World Cup qualifiers in 2009, Adriano didn't return to Italy. He disappeared into the favela for several days, and the media speculated wildly. When he reappeared, he held a press conference to explain his decision. He said simply that he was stopping because he'd lost the joy of playing football. He walked away from millions of euros from the highest level of the sport, a decision that many in Europe thought was madness, but Adriano didn't frame it that way. He said that he was not finished with life, but he could just no longer continue playing in Milan. He said he needed to go home. Despite the acrimonious end to his time at Inter, Flamengo welcomed Adriano back in May 2009. This was his home, and the supporters at the stadium treated him as a returning hero. More than 50,000 additional tickets were sold for his debut, and the chants that greeted him announced that the Emperor had come home. For one season, it seemed that the story might yet find a different ending. Adriano scored 19 goals and led Flamengo to their first Brazilian championship in 17 years. He would later say that he'd given up millions of euros, but he'd bought happiness instead. Back in the favela, surrounded by his family and friends, he felt human again. He was no longer a product to be managed, he was simply himself. But the professional world doesn't operate like a favela, and the demands of elite football returned quickly. Behind the scenes, some of the same problems persisted. His fitness remained a struggle. He fell out with members of the staff and was questioned by police over associations with figures in the favela. There were reported disciplinary issues. He was still capable of brilliance, but he no longer wanted to sustain the discipline required to produce them regularly. In June 2010, Roma took a gamble that few saw coming, offering a 3-year contract in the hope that a return to Italy might reignite what had been lost. After arriving in Rome, he struggled immediately with the intensity of training. Claudio Ranieri spoke publicly about his disappointment and urged him to be more focused. Injuries followed, and a broken arm suffered in a derby against Lazio effectively ended his brief time back at the club. He returned to Brazil to recover, but stayed longer than permitted. After only 7 months, his contract was terminated. He tried once more in 2011 with Corinthians, but fate intervened again. During training, he ruptured his Achilles tendon. He spent 7 months in rehab, but when he returned, it was clear that the player he once had been was no longer there. He'd lost his acceleration, his strength, his confidence, and his love of the game. He left Corinthians in 2012 and spent the next years drifting through spells at Atletico Parmense and later Miami United in the lower leagues of American football. In 2016, at the age of 34, he retired. In later interviews, he admitted that he'd known it was over long before the end. He said that when he ruptured his Achilles tendon, he understood that he was finished physically, just as he'd understood years earlier that he'd finished emotionally when his father had died. Today, Adriano spends most of his time back where it all began, in Via Cruzeiro. To the outside world, the images that surface of him on social media are often used as a punchline or a warning. He's seen as sitting barefoot on plastic chairs on the pavement, holding drinks or riding on the back of a motorbike. The media portray this as a fall from grace and use the word waste. Adriano tells a different story. He says that he's found peace, and in the favela he doesn't have to be the emperor, and he can live without the expectations that once followed him everywhere. He can play dominoes and belong somewhere without being measured. He's spoken honestly about his struggles with alcohol and admitting that he drank to excess because it's difficult to live with the weight of being called a legend when you feel like a disappointment. Even so, it's difficult to describe his life as a failure. He reached heights that most footballers will never approach. Won major titles, won the Copa América. For a brief period, he was the most dominant striker in world football. He earned enough to secure his family for generations. He escaped the favela, saw the world, and then chose to return. In 2021, he was inducted into the Maracanã Stadium Walk of Fame. When he saw his footprints placed alongside those of Pele, Garrincha, and Zico, he broke down in tears. The recognition of what he'd been and what he'd given. The story of Adriano is a reminder that we often treat athletes as characters rather than people. We measure them by medals, appearances, and statistics, and forget that their lives don't end when their careers do. His career should not be remembered for how long it lasted, but for how intensely it burned. For a few seasons, he showed a power and a force that may never be seen again. And he reminded us that football's not just a game of tactics and systems, but emotion. When we watch his goals today, we shouldn't feel pity, but genuine gratitude for having witnessed a striker at the height of his physical and technical powers. Adriano's career wasn't a waste, he was just a man who chose a different life after a tragic event. The crown is gone, but the legend remains. And somewhere in the Via Cruzeiro, as another generation of boys kick a ball across the same dirt pitches, he's no longer a man living in the past, but a man who, finally, found the peace that football never gave him. If you've enjoyed this story about Adriano, be sure to check out some of the other videos on my channel. Be sure to check out the range of infographics and digital downloads available in the description below. What are your memories of Adriano? Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, stay tuned for more football history, one incredible story at a time.